This is Superman, James Gunn's 2025 blockbuster hit, garnering $613 million globally on a $225 million budget. And needless to say, it was a massive success. But Superman has always been one of the hardest heroes to get right. Push him too far towards perfection, and he stops feeling human. Push him too far towards myth, and he starts to feel distant. For decades, filmmakers have wrestled with that exact balance. James Gunn's Superman took a different path. This version leans into hope, sincerity, comic book weirdness, and vulnerability. Not just a Superman who can save the day, but a Superman who can bleed, doubt himself, and still choose goodness anyways. And one of the biggest reasons that works is not just writing or the performances, it is the edit. Because the real question behind this movie is not just how do you make Superman exciting again, is how do you make Superman feel human again? And the answer lies in the way this film was shaped, scene by scene, beat by beat, and sometimes frame by frame. At the center of that process was Azariah Hoy and Cred Output. Hoy came in with a background in large-scale effects-heavy filmmaking, including the Batman and the Planet of the Apes films. Output brought a different strength however, comedy and ensemble timing, with credits including Deadpool 2. On paper, that is an unusual pairing. In practice, it was exactly what this movie needed, because Superman keeps changing registers. It moves from newsroom banter to romance, from giant action to emotional confession, from oddball comic book word building to a deeply personal crisis at the center of Clark Kent's story. A movie like that can easily feel split in half. One tone for the jokes, another for the spectacle, another for the emotional material. But Oi and Output did not treat the film like two editors cutting two separate films. As Albert described it, they passed scenes back and forth rather than dividing the film rigorously in half. Both of them worked across the whole thing. That overlap mattered because it helped the film feel unified even as it kept shifting gears. That collaboration is not just a nice behind the scenes detail, it is the reason the movie can jump from awkward Daily Planet comedy to an emotional Clark Kent moment without feeling like two different films stitched together. That same balance shows up in the film's visual language. Cinematographer Henry Braham said the goal was to make the film feel grounded. Finding a balance between truth and fantasy, he also said the movie is about humanity, fallibility, and the power of goodness and hope. That is important because it tells you what the filmmakers were actually chasing. Not simply scare, not just visual polish, a myth made human. Braham primarily shot the movie with Panavision's Red V Viper X cameras, and he described the camera approach as grounded and often handheld, but stabilized it so it would not abstract from the story. That matters because the visual strategy and editorial strategy are aligned. Both are trying to keep Superman connected to people rather than floating around them as an untouchable icon. That is key to the whole movie. The film does not try to make Superman smaller by taking away his myth, it makes him relatable by surrounding that myth with physical vulnerability, emotional uncertainty, and human texture. Nowhere is that clearer than in the Daily Planet material. Those scenes may look effortless on screen, but Oi described them as massive and complicated because the cameras was constantly moving, and the actors were free to roam to shape those sequences themselves. He had assistants break down the dialogue line by line so he could track who said what in which shot. He needed to know exactly where to go wide, where to go closer, and how to preserve both continuity and timing. That tells you something important about this movie's priorities. The newsroom scenes are not just filler between action beats, they are central to the film's identity. This is where Clark Kent exists as a co-worker, a partner, and a person trying to belong. This is where the movie owns its humanity, and the edit had to preserve all the tiny reactions that make those scenes feel alive. Lois watching Clark, Jimmy's side interactions, Steve Lumber's comical timing, all the little moments that create social texture. Alpert said a major Lois and Clark apartment scene lived or died on timing, rhythm, and reactions. That is editorial language, but it is also character language, because in a scene like that, what matters is not only the line itself, it is the pause before it, the look after it, the hesitation that reveals what someone feels before they say it out loud. A lot of superhero movies can stage a fight, far fewer know how to cut a conversation that it carries the same dramatic weight. On Superman, Lee and Chase worked as an embedded avid sound mixer and liaison between picture editorial and the broader sound team. That did not mean the editors was hearing a finished theatrical mix while cutting. It meant the sound was integrated into the process much earlier and more deeply than people usually imagine. Hoy said the workflow was especially valuable for screenings because it let the team keep refining picture and sound in Avid instead of locking everything early just to go off to a traditional temp mix. In a film where visual effects was arriving late and constantly evolving, that flexibility was a major advantage. And this is where the movie's emotional intelligence becomes very clear. In Art of the Cut, Chase explains that one of the crucial lessons from working with Hoy and Apit was the sound design had to serve the story point of a moment, not just the literal event on screen. In one scene involving a death Superman cannot prevent, the emphasis was not simply on the death itself. The emphasis was the fact that Superman has to live with it afterwards. That shift matters because it reorientates the entire emotional center of the sequence towards Clark's pain and helplessness. That is a huge idea. Even the sound is being shaped around vulnerability. Not how do we make this hit harder, but what is Superman feeling right now and how do we trap the audience inside that feeling? The more publicized technical breakthrough on the film came from Framestore's work on the holograms of Superman's Kryptonian parents. According to Framestore, the movie marked the first integration of 3D Gaussian splatting in a feature film. The workflow was developed with infinite realities and used nearly 200 cameras at once to capture performances volumetrically, preserving much more of the actor's photographic detail than a standard CG recreation. Framestore says that gave the filmmakers unusual freedom in post, including the ability to distort and fragment the holograms in three-dimensional space for story purposes. And it is enough, because the real point is not that the movie used fancy new tech, the point is why it used it. These holograms are not there to show off a breakthrough, they are there to make Clark's connection to his Kryptonian parents feel tangible, unstable, and emotional present. The technology works because it sharpens character, not because it exists. That is one of the biggest takeaways from this whole movie. The tools changed, the goal did not. Everything still comes back to whether we feel closer to Clark Kent himself. And this is where the editing story becomes the most revealing. Hoy said the third act was the area they had to address the most. Early on, the climax jumped among several threads, Superman fighting Ultraman, the events in the Rift, and other large-scale action, but in the cut, that structure would not flow in the way it needed to. Hoy said they were trying to tell too many stories at the same time. The through line had to remain Superman. That distinction matters. The issue was not that the surrounding material was worthless, the issue was that too much cross-cut weakened focus. So the filmmakers streamlined the climax, trimmed down material, and kept the audience anchored more firmly to Superman's struggle. In Hoy's words, the through line is Superman, we should follow him. That is an structural choice, it is also a philosophical one, because the movie gets bigger by becoming more selective. It stopped trying to prove scale through quantity and starts proving it through clarity. And there was another revealing example of that same instinct. Hoy said there was too many endings, so a scene between Superman and Mr. Terrific looking at the crack in the wall was pulled from the body of the film and moved to the very end after the credits. That is a real-sourced editorial decision. What it tells us is simple. The team kept refining what belonged to the emotional landing of the movie and what should live outside it. That is what discipline looks like in blockbuster editing. Not adding more, but knowing what to move, what to trim, and what to protect. Maybe the clearest example of all is one emotional scene with Clark and his father. Hoy said the scene centered on David Kernsweat's close-up and that Kernsweat hit the key emotional moments in a single take. Hoy's approach was simple, to get to that moment because that moment is the story of the scene. That is not flashy editing, that is restraint. In a film packed with effects, action, word building, and tonal shifts, one of the boldest choices is to trust a face, to trust a pause, and to trust that audiences will stay with a vulnerable human without the movie cutting away to save them from stillness. And maybe that is the real answer to this question. How do you make Superman feel human again? Not by making him less super, by making the film care just as much about his hesitation, his emotional life, and how it affects his power. That is why the editing of Superman matters. William Hoy and Cred Alpert was not organizing coverage or tightening action, they was managing tone, emphasis, and emotional access. They had to balance sincerity with comedy, scare with clarity, and mythology with vulnerability. They had to figure out how to widen the film and when to narrow it back down to Clark Kent. So yes, Superman uses cutting-edge tools. Yes, it features major visual effects and invention. Yes, it launches a new DC universe. But the strongest thing it does is much simpler than that. It remembers that Superman only works when the audiences does not just admire him, they have to fear with him. And in James Gunn's Superman, the edit is one of the biggest reasons it does.